Now that's more like it. For an aggrieved president, the warm welcome in Saudi Arabia kicked off a bold gambit to unite Muslim nations against extremism. The president, who had once campaigned on banning Muslims, now offered an olive branch to members of the world's largest religion. But back home, the president's domestic agenda has remained interrupted by chaos and questions over whether his campaign worked with Russians to influence the 2016 presidential election, and whether he fired FBI Director James Comey to divert his investigation of the matter. Comey agreed to testify publicly in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. What do senators want to hear from him? We'll hear from a key Republican on the committee, Senator Marco Rubio. And what can we expect from the newly appointed special counsel, former FBI Director Robert Mueller, as he takes the reins of a growing investigation? We'll talk to the top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Diane Feinstein. Plus, what do Americans make of all of this? We'll have some answers from our latest Nation Tracker survey, and our politics panel will also weigh in. It's all coming up on Face the Nation. Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. It was another week of chaos and distraction for President Trump, and he wasn't happy about it.
No politician in history, and I say this with great surety, has been treated worse or more unfairly.
But much of the trouble was self-inflicted. Monday, the Washington Post reported that the president had given the Russians highly classified information that normally wouldn't be shared with friendly countries, let alone an adversary. Tuesday, the New York Times reported that the FBI had a memo from former FBI Director James Comey that said the president had asked him to let go of the federal investigation into former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Republican Senator John McCain was reminded of previous presidential tampering.
I think we've seen this movie before. I think it's reaching the point where it's of Watergate size and scale.
The biggest news came Wednesday when a special counsel was named to investigate Russia's involvement in the 2016 presidential campaign. President Trump was asked about the decision.
Well, I respect the move, but the entire thing has been a witch hunt.
Friday, a flood of revelations as the president left on a carefully planned 8-day foreign trip. The first headline, the FBI investigation is looking at a senior official close to the president. The second, that the investigation now includes the possibility of a White House cover-up. And the third, that the president told the Russians something else in that meeting, that firing FBI Director Comey had relieved him of the pressure of his investigation. The president this morning is in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, giving a speech on Islam and terrorism. We're joined now by White House and senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan, who is traveling with the president. Margaret?
Good morning. Well, reaching out to leaders of more than 50 Muslim-majority countries who are gathered here in Saudi Arabia, President Trump is calling for unity against extremism. He's abandoning that campaign-era rhetoric against Islam, a religion he once said hates us, even calling for the shutdown of all Muslims from entering the U.S. Today, right now, he's trying to recast that instead as a battle between all decent people and the barbaric criminals he says falsely invoke the name of God. Unlike past U.S. presidents, Mr. Trump is making it a policy to avoid any public criticism of human rights abuses, saying we are not here to lecture. And he has lifted those Obama-era restrictions on certain weapons sales, inking a $110 billion deal with Saudi Arabia. And the kingdom has warmly embraced President Trump with honors that they did not bestow on his predecessor. U.S. relations were damaged in large part by the Obama-era's outreach to Iran. So while President Trump is bringing with him all the baggage of those domestic issues, so far he is sticking to scripted remarks and he's avoiding Twitter. But John, he's got 8 more stops on this foreign trip, and tomorrow he heads to Israel.
Thank you, Margaret. We turn to Republican Senator Marco Rubio, who joins us from Miami, Florida. Welcome, Senator. I want to start with former Director James Comey. He will testify in front of the Intelligence Committee, which you are on. What do you want to know from Director Comey?
Well, obviously, look, these media reports that are out there raise questions that deserve answers. What did the president say? Did, in fact, you keep memos? What do those memos say, and why did you write them? And what was your feeling? And the American public deserves to know the answers to that. I think that's fair to the president. I think that's fair to former Director Comey, and I think that's fair to the country.
What did you make of the New York Times report, which apparently came just from the notes taken by the White House note takers in the meeting between the president and the Russians, in which the president said, "I just fired the head of the FBI. He was crazy, a real nut job. I faced great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off."
Well, I haven't seen the notes. I told people earlier this week I had a conversation with the White House. People that were in that meeting, they denied that anything had been said in that meeting that could compromise sources, methods, or information with regards to intelligence. They said there were no transcripts. They said there were notes. I encouraged them to make those notes available to the committees. That has not happened, and of course, apparently someone has discussed them or leaked them or what have you, but we haven't seen them. So I don't know if that's an accurate description of what's in the notes, and that's why it's important that the Intelligence Committee and those conducting this inquiry look at them.
That's right. And there were two elements of that meeting with the Russians. One, possible classified information that was handed over. The other, this question about what may have been said about James Comey. Is one thing you're interested in, at least with respect to Comey, though, whether there was an attempt to interfere with the investigation by the president?
Well, look, that's a relevant question that needs to be asked and it needs to be answered. But the question is, how are they asked and answered? Do you do it through the press, or do you do it through the processes that are now moving forward? Director Mueller, or former Director Mueller, has now been appointed. I think virtually everyone has full confidence that he's going to conduct a thorough and fair investigation and a look at all of these things and give answers. And we're now going to look at it and continue to look at it from a counterintelligence perspective. And that's our job.
I wanted to get your response to something the White House said about Director Comey that bears on foreign policy. Sean Spicer, the press secretary, said that by grandstanding and politicizing the investigation into Russian actions, James Comey created unnecessary pressure on our ability to engage and negotiate with Russia. Do you think that's right?
Well, that may be the White House's opinion. I don't necessarily share that 100%, assuming that that's in fact what Director Comey was doing. I don't think that that does, because at the end of the day, the United States of America remains a major factor, if not the major factor, on the global stage. And American foreign policy resides not solely in the hands of the White House, but also the Congress. As you know, there's plenty of votes in Congress for additional sanctions. So I don't necessarily believe that it undermined our ability to deal with the Russians. That's my view of it. Obviously, the White House has a different take, but I don't think that. Isn't
it, Senator, also the fact that the Russians, by trying to meddle in the election, undermined the U.S. ability to negotiate with the Russians?
Well, certainly, I mean, it's a factor in our relationship. There is no doubt. And that should be the core focus of the Intel Committee's work, is to lay out to the American people not just what Russia did. I think we have a pretty good view of that already, but how they did it and what it means for the future and what we should be doing about it.
Let me ask you about this report that classified information was given. The president said he was giving information to the Russians in that meeting in order to help them, quote, greatly step up their fight against ISIS and terrorism. Do you think that's a possibility, that by giving them information that the Russians will step up and help with ISIS?
Well, two things. First of all, I don't know what the Russians knew already, number one, or at least I won't discuss that. Number two, I'm not sure that's what the president did, that he gave them that sort of information. Everybody that was in the room that I've spoken to denies that that's what happened, but obviously that'll be a focus of the inquiries as we move forward. And number three, I think the Russians, if they cooperate against terrorism, it will be to the extent that it's in their interest vis-a-vis their view of the United States. Who they define as terrorists is not simply ISIS. They also define as terrorists virtually any group on the ground that is confronting Assad. We're focused on radical jihadists. They're focused not just on that, but anybody who is trying to get rid of Assad.
Senator McConnell, Republican leader in the Senate, said he'd like a little less drama out of the White House. Do you share that view?
Well, look, I mean, I don't understand why people are that shocked. This president ran a very unconventional campaign. I was there for a big part of it at the beginning, alongside being one of his competitors. And that's what the American people voted for. And in essence, you know, this White House is not much different from the campaign. I mean, people got what they voted for. They elected him. Obviously, it's in the best interest of this country to try to help him succeed. As far as the drama is concerned, yeah, I mean, it's unique. It's different from anything we've ever confronted. I think our job remains to do our work. We'll have to deal with these issues. These issues come up, these questions, every single day. And I do think the White House would benefit from some systems in place that perhaps avoids some of the unnecessary friction points that come up on a daily basis. But this is also the political environment we now live in, too. I mean, politics are covered this way, and politicians also behave in this way because they know they can get attention for saying things one way or the other. It's just the way politics has moved. I don't think it's good for the country, but that's where we're headed for now, apparently.
Let me ask you a question about how you see the Trump administration and the message they send about human rights. On the one hand, this week, the administration sanctioned 8 Venezuelan judges. And you said, this is an issue you've been working on, the United States is not going to allow those who impede democracy to violate human rights. But then, on the other hand, the administration towards countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Russia even, seems to have a more muted public voice about human rights. How are we to weigh those two differences?
Well, it's not an approach that I entirely agree with. I certainly believe that we need to confront Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and all the human rights violators in the world. And the White House is willing to do so publicly for nations that are hostile towards the United States. They believe, and it's a point of disagreement, but they believe that on the countries that are cooperative with us on other issues, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, we should privately confront them on the issues of human rights, that you'll get a better result that way. Now, I have a different take on it. I believe human rights are important for us to speak about publicly. The human rights activists in those countries would agree because they're demoralized when they don't hear it. But in fairness, the White House has gotten results. I remember raising the issue of Aya Hijazi repeatedly with the White House. They raised it in private with Egypt. She was released. Sandy Fangilis was being held unjustly in China. I raised it with the White House. They raised it privately with the Chinese. She was released. So I do want to acknowledge they have gotten results through their approach. But I think from a broader perspective, I disagree with it. I've told them that. They know that's a point of disagreement with me because I believe that these countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the like, are not sustainable in the long term if they continue to systemically violate the rights of their people.
Okay.